Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Humanities 102. I am here to talk to you a little about the history of the West. Um, our course, of course, is an intellectual, sort of intellectual history of the West, but there's stuff that happened before we're going to start, or we start. So my goal here today is to kind of give you a historical background to our class, right? You don't have to take any notes. This is just to give you a sense of what you got. Some of it will be familiar to you anyway. And I say this because history really matters, and history matters to understand how people act. So, for instance, if you ever are in an argument or you've done something that people think you should have done, right? You will explain yourself. You'll say, I did that because. Well, that's history, right? That's saying something happened prior that made me feel like I had to do this thing today. Now, people may not agree with you, but that's how you use history, right? You explain yourself. So, I want to give you a quick review of the history of the West as a way of thinking about how we've begun, right? So, first, there's prehistory. Prehistory is just everything that happened before the invention of writing. That's everything. That's dinosaurs. That's the birth of the earth. That's the evolution of birds. That's the evolution of human beings. The use of caves where we lived. Everything before writing, right? It's prehistory because we use history to figure out what happened. And so we use writing, to figure out what happened in history. So that's why writing and history are synonymous. So then you have ancient history. Now, the world, we think of the West thinks of the world as basically ancient history, the medieval period, and modern. Okay. So ancient begins with the invention of writing, as you can imagine, right? And it includes some very famous works, some of which you'd see in Humanities 101. So, for instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest known literary work, the Iliad, which is a great work of the Greeks, the Old Testament, which Christians call the Old Testament, wasn't called that by the Hebrews, but it is a great work of Hebrew thought, right? So the whole ancient world ends with the Roman Empire when it falls. But the two big things about the ancient world for our purposes are the Greeks and the Romans. So the Greeks are huge, right? We see them as the founders of democracy, and also they invented philosophy. So Socrates is like the first serious philosopher we recognize, and Plato is the most famous philosopher we recognize. And we have philosophy today because of that. Many of these words, like philosophy, is actually a Greek word, the love of wisdom. All right, so they're also really big things was the Peloponnesian War. It was a huge world war for them. And what we learned about fighting war comes from, first of all, that book. One general wrote a book about that war, and the insights were incredible, right? So these are all things we get from the Greeks. Music, our theories of music come from the Greeks, so many things. And then, of course, then there's the later Greeks. As the Greeks passed their height, you have Aristotle, the philosophical student of Plato, and a huge influence on the West. And his most famous pupil was Alexander the Great, which you've probably heard of him. He went on to conquer most of the known world. He got as far as India in his conquering. He didn't last very long. He died very young. But he spread the Greek language. So suddenly people all over the place were speaking Greek, the way everybody in the world speaks English today, and the way everybody in the world used to speak Latin, right? So huge influence, right? So Greeks. But the Greeks went down as the Romans went up. So the Romans went around as a republic for about 500 years. You'd recognize them too. They had a Senate, they had the rule of law, very familiar to Americans. And around 44 BC, they fell and became the Roman Empire, right? That's because they were taken over by dictators, emperors. They were essentially dictators, and they were run by the military. So they lost a lot of their sense of freedom that they may have thought they had, right? So the late Roman period, before the end of the Roman period, you see the rise of Christianity. So when Rome was at its best, Christianity was a small one of many sects. It just wasn't very important. In fact, it was relatively persecuted, as you know. As the Roman period fell, the Christianity period rose. And then we enter the medieval period. So once the Roman Empire collapses, everything falls apart, right? Nothing's coordinating. Imagine if the country fell apart and all of a sudden every city was on its own, right? Nothing would be holding them together. There'd be no coordination. So like nothing holds together any longer. That's why it was often called the Dark Ages, right? But that's a period where Christianity really rises, right? The church becomes super important. So what you see is an end of a material empire that cared about roads and aqueducts. That was for the Romans. They were an empire of engineers. And a rise of a spiritual empire where it was more important to worry about your soul than it was to worry about roads, right? And sewers and things like that. But it was the rise of the Catholic Church, a huge influence at the time, right? And Emperor Constantine was the first emperor in the Roman Empire who switched from pagan to Christian. So it went from persecuting Christians to persecuting pagans. And he also moved the capital of Rome. He moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a city called Constantinople, which is now known as Istanbul. So the whole move put the Roman Empire, no longer Roman, it's called now the Byzantine Empire, to the east of where it used to be. And it stayed there until 1453 when Byzantine fell to the Muslim invaders when they took over Constantinople, and it turned into Istanbul, which is still an Islamic city today. Whole new economic system called feudalism rose. You get the rise of Islam, starting in the 7th century, the 600s, which is still with us today anyway. So all that period, very religious period, right? But things started changing after the fall of Constantinople. And that's when we start getting into the modern period, which is the period our class is about. So what makes this period unique? First of all, the printing press. Printing press is huge, right? People will learn to read, and by reading, get new ideas, and new ideas can challenge all ideas, right? So for instance, by being able to read, more and more people could read the Bible for themselves rather than just listen to their priest. And then you get a lot of disagreements. And that led to the Protestant Reformation, which is the rise of all these religions that aren't Catholic, that are in the country today, like Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Baptist. They're all from reacting against the Catholic Church, right? And of course, the Catholics reacted to that with the Counter-Reformation. You get these huge religious wars. And these religious wars were so horrible, so destructive, that it really led people to think after it was over that we can never let that happen again. And so when you have this notion of the separation of church and state, that's because of those religious wars. People didn't want that to happen again. So they had to find ways to deal with that. So that's very modern now. And of course, there's the European Renaissance. And I know you've heard of the Renaissance, right? Big thing about the Renaissance is, one, it shifts the value of man over God. So in the medieval period, God was first and men didn't matter. It kind of alternates. Now mankind is more important, and what we can do, men and what they can do, becomes very, very important, right? So like, what can they do? Well, first of all, men are traveling over the horizon and discovering new lands, like Christopher Columbus, right? Discovering new peoples, new cultures, new ideas. Sure, they treated those people badly, there's no doubt about it. But those ideas still influence. A lot of people started thinking that was wrong to treat those people that way. A lot of people thinking there were new ideas they never thought of before in a time when they weren't used to new ideas. And it was a time where new ideas were considered threatening and evil. No longer. That ended. But a big part of the Renaissance was also the development of scientific thinking. And this is a big troublesome thing for religion, right? Because remember, medieval people was very religious, right? So let's say your child is really sick and you pray to God for health and the kid dies. And another kid gets sick and you go to a doctor who's a scientist who gives you a cure. You're starting to think, well, who can do it? Does God do it or does science? And it seems like science is more effective. So it's a huge change. So who does science? Men do science. People do science. So therefore, valuing people over God starts to happen. Okay. So all these influences are going on, just all up to the moment we start a class, when we start reading. So we're going to look at questions about how do we continue to believe in God, given all these things? What is the right way to live our lives if you don't believe in God? What is the universe if it's not simply just God's creation? Then what is it? Right? All these are, what does it mean to be a person if we're not just, a child of Adam and Eve? And these are the kinds of questions we're going to watch writers grapple with throughout the rest of this semester. So thanks for listening, and let's